Good evening and welcome. You know, tonight is our first in-person presentation in almost 2 years. Almost 2 years to the date. In fact, in September 2019, Governor Granholm was here, September 19th, and then on October 17th, Professor David Myers was here from Hope College talking about what in the world's going on with, you know, all this craziness in the world and in the United States today. So 2 years, and it's really good to be back together in person. Earlier this year, we did 2 virtual presentations, one in February with Dr. Clifford Lane from the National Institute of Health, and then in April, we did our second virtual presentation with Professor Paul Isley talking about the economy post-pandemic. So we've talked extensively about the pandemic, and hopefully tonight we're going to be spending more time talking about what does the future hold. Now, in all fairness, I have to tell you, when we scheduled this presentation, we titled it, "The Pandemic is Under Control." We did this in May. The pandemic is under control. Now what? And about a month ago, we changed that to "The Pandemic Continues." And now, before we do anything else, I want to bring up our Vice President of the Speaker Series, Julie Cowie, and she is going to introduce our speaker this evening. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you. So as my sister would say, it's good to be together, and it is good to see you out tonight. Thanks for coming. Back in the 1980s, when I was a young and bored secretary for my dad's somewhat grimy tool and die shop in Madison Heights, the highlight of my day was the mail. And the highlight of the mail was an oversized, glossy publication then called Monthly Detroit, which I pored over. And a year after the launch of Monthly Detroit that celebrated Detroit's talent and style, Gertrude Crain, then chair of Crain Communications Incorporated, named her son Keith Crain as publisher of the new Crain's Detroit Business in February of 1985. So women of Crain Communications have been making great decisions ever since. It was Mary Kramer, publisher and editor of Crain's Detroit Business for 32 years, who urged us to invite Kelley Root as tonight's guest presenter for the South Haven Speaker Series. Named executive editor of Crain's Detroit Business since the start of the pandemic, March 16th was her first day on the job. Kelley Root has covered news across the state. Beginning at age 16, she then went on to graduate from Michigan State University, where she served as editor-in-chief of the state news. Kelley then spent 15 years at the Grand Rapids Press as a reporter and assistant city editor. She moved to Detroit and started with the Detroit News in 2004, spending 16 years in editorial roles, concluding as managing editor. She left the Detroit News in February of 2020 to take the lead with Crain's Detroit Business a month later, where she is executive editor. I can't think of a person better suited to tell the story of Michigan businesses in the pandemic than Kelley Root, whose leadership at Crain's Detroit Business has coincided with this most tumultuous time. Kelley is the surviving spouse of a marriage to Douglas Guthrie, who died in 2013. He also shared a life career of journalism. They have a daughter, Grace, and Kelley also has a stepson and stepdaughter who are a bit older. Please join me in welcoming Kelley Root to South Haven.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Julie. I appreciate that. Welcome to everybody. Thank you for having me. We are all learning how to be in public again, and I'm thrilled to address you all in person. This has been an enormously challenging time for all of us. And I'm happy to say that I made the drive from Detroit today down 94 with no interruptions or backups, so I consider that to be a big victory. And, as noted, I worked in Grand Rapids for many years and lived in Grand Rapids and from Detroit, but I worked on the west side of the state, and this is an area that, I'm a fond visitor and a frequent visitor, so I very much appreciate the opportunity to talk tonight. And I want to be kind of informal here. What I envision for our evening is to tell you a little bit about myself just informally and a little bit about Crain, and then talk a little bit with some slides here looking at some of the industries and the effect of COVID on the industries that we've covered at Crain. And then take some questions and just kind of have a discussion about what a crazy year it's been for workers in industry and business of all types. And journalism questions, I love to talk about journalism. It's been my career for 30 years. I've seen lots of changes. As I started at Crain on the day that we all went home. And moving over to Crain was a big decision for me because I'd been in daily journalism at the Detroit News for a long time. I daily papers my whole life, and Mary Kramer came calling, and you don't say no to Mary Kramer. She's a very persuasive person, and I was at the point in my career where the idea of leading a small staff that specialized in business beats, and it was a very appealing leap for me after doing general journalism for so long to come into a publication where we specialized, and Crain's is a very small, very tight-knit, very talented staff, and some of them had worked at the news, so I was going over to a staff that I was familiar with, and I was very happy to make the leap. And I took a couple weeks off. I took my daughter on a vacation to Arizona. I was trying to make the emotional transition, and meanwhile there was this thing kind of happening in the background called coronavirus, and of course nobody knew exactly what was going to transpire, but we were hiking in Sedona one day, and I thought, we really need to get back on a plane and get back to Michigan because the cases were starting to rise, and so, we flew back, and it got really bad really fast. And I remember, watching the TV reports and thinking, oh my gosh, Crain maybe they don't need an executive editor. Maybe they've decided that, it's just fine to not hire at a time when everything is shutting down. Thankfully they did, and my first day was, March 16th. And I came in, and the staff thankfully showed up to say hello and meet me, and I got my laptop and I filled out my paperwork for my direct deposit and basically went home. So, yeah, welcome to the new executive editor, right? We made it work, and we are making it work. And I'm grateful to have, I think, a smaller staff because, the Detroit News is putting out a daily print product. Crain's is putting out a weekly print product, so the production demands are a little bit less intense. And we really focus during the pandemic on communication, and our lives switched overnight to Zoom, and we meet every morning, and we talk about story ideas, and we try to make up for the lack of in-person communication with constant Slack and Outlook and Teams and Zoom, and overnight we had to invent a whole new way to communicate. Not only were we doing that, we were covering the biggest story that we'd ever covered in all of our lives. And that's true of my journalism colleagues at TV stations, radio, magazines. This is the biggest story we will ever live through, for better or for worse. And, what I want to talk about tonight is a little bit of how we've done that, what I've seen along the way, how businesses have adapted, how our coverage reflects what's going to happen in the next year. We don't know. Nobody One of the things the pandemic has taught us is that all of the prognostications and everybody who thinks that all the experts, suddenly were not necessarily experts, because the COVID hit different industries in different ways, and it's still ongoing. It is not over, and one of the things that we'll talk about tonight are the ongoing impacts on the labor shortage and education and healthcare. Everything that we know is being reinvented as we speak. We're building the plane as it's flying, and that's one of the things that I will talk about in just a minute. I also want to congratulate everybody for being out in person, and I'm so glad that we're finally able to do events like this. One of the frustrating things for me as a new executive editor was that I took this job because I love to go out and talk to people and represent Crain and be out in the community as the public face of Crain, and the first thing that happened was that we went home and everything shut down. We all pivoted to online events. We had to learn new ways of delivering the same product at Crain, and for us that's a lot of online events. I had to interview Governor Whitmer I had a one-on-one interview, and I was very happy to have the time with her. It was on a video platform that we were learning as we went. I mean, we tested it, we did all of the things that you're supposed to do, and I remember sitting down with her in the studio. Well, she wasn't in the studio, she was in Lansing, I was in our studio at Crain, and I looked at the screen, and she looked fabulous, like a movie star with her hair and her makeup and her, great clothes. And I looked at myself, and I was this little pinhead with a black background because our video setup was not ideal. It didn't necessarily match up great, but we forged ahead. The interview went well. We are learning as we go, how to do the same things we've always done, but in a totally different way. But the great thing about this recent couple of months is that we're tentatively taking steps back into real life, I guess you would say. I was at the Mackinac Policy Conference on Mackinac Island 2 weeks ago, and that was really kind of my first time being out representing Crain, meeting people, and it was really, I enjoyed being up there, but it was weird. People nowadays, when you go to in-person events now, don't know how to necessarily behave. There's the fear of COVID. Are you wearing a mask? Are you vaccinated? One of the funny things about the conference was that, we were all vaccinated. We had to have proof of vaccination, and as we came in to register, they handed out bowls of rubber bracelets, green, yellow, and red, and you were supposed to take a rubber bracelet and wear it throughout the conference, and that would signal your level of comfort with physical contact. So green, so green meant you can shake hands, you can hug me, I'm open. Yellow was elbow, fist bumps. Red was back off, buddy. And it was their attempt to give us all a way to, when you approach someone, you were supposed to look and find their bracelet. I, by the way, took all three colors, depending on which person was coming at me. Because I figured that in an event like that, you never knew who you were going to run into, and sometimes holding that red up came in handy. But I ended up writing a column about this. After the first hour, everything went out the window. No one was looking underneath suit jackets for the color of the bracelet. Human nature is such that when you see someone that you haven't seen for 2 years or 3 years, whether it's a colleague or a friend or a business associate, you go in for a hug, or you shake hands. It's very hard to be so scripted and careful, even when you have the best of intentions. Luckily, I think that hopefully it didn't appear to be a super spreader event, and thankfully everybody was vaccinated and seemed to be okay. But it just really showed for me how important human connection is, especially when it comes to business. And I don't do a lot of business networking. I'm not a businesswoman. I'm a journalist, and I cover business. But I've realized in the last year and a half how important communication and connection is in the business world. Because it's important for me to get out and meet the people that Crain's is covering, to understand the industries that we cover, and after a year of Zoom and after a year of webinars and sort of endless online meetings, it's just really refreshing, to be here in person. And I'm glad we don't have bracelets, so thank you for that, because I think they're of dubious value. But it's an example of how creative people are trying to be as we rejoin normalcy. And, as mentioned, 6 months ago when we first talked about this, the idea was that everything would be wrapped up in a neat bow, and I could stand up here and talk about how every industry has completely emerged, and this is what's happened, and we're back on the right track. And of course, the Delta variant threw an enormous wrench into all of our plans to come back, and my own office included. I'll tell you a little bit about Crain. We've been around since 1985, and we are in a nice big building down by Eastern Market in Detroit at I-75 in Gratiot. And Crain's Detroit has about, I would say, maybe a 15-person editorial staff. We cover beats ranging from healthcare to banking to manufacturing, state government. We have a lot of specialized beats that we cover that I'll talk a little bit more about here tonight. But we are back 1 day a week, essentially, in person, not required. We have not forced anybody to come back. Like a lot of companies, we're trying to be mindful of people's different levels of comfort about returning to the office. So we try to meet on Monday mornings and have our editorial meetings, and then, we communicate mostly by Zoom or Teams the rest of the week. But we are a brand that also has automotive news is on our floor. We share space with automotive news, Ad Age, modern healthcare. Those are part of the Crain family. We have city books, as we call them, in Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, and New York. So we do have a presence in other cities, and it's been a little bit easier, as I mentioned, for me to oversee a smaller staff during the pandemic than it would be at the Detroit News, and it's a very different kind of journalism at Crain too. We have an audience that really is engaged and are sophisticated readers and want to buy our product, and they pay for Crain, and we try very hard to be in tune with the kind of topics that they want to read. So it's a different kind of journalism. It's been a little bit easier because of the size of the staff to communicate during the pandemic, but it has been a challenge for everybody. And my friends back at the Detroit News, I think, have really done a great job getting a paper out every single day, a print copy of the paper. That's very hard to do, that kind of production from afar. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the beats that we cover. I'm not going to be able to cover every single business or every single industry tonight, but I would like to focus on some of the key areas of our coverage for Crain, talk a little bit about the challenges that each area has dealt with during the pandemic, and then where they are now and the challenges going forward. One of the joys of journalism is that whatever presentation you do is going to change within 5 minutes. There's news breaking every day. I had this all finished, and then Ford made that massive announcement last week about, the EV and battery plants being built down in Tennessee and Kentucky. So we'll talk a little bit about that. The Spectrum Beaumont merger is another one of the major stories that we've been covering that affects both West Michigan and East Michigan. I'll talk a little bit about that tonight. I'm not an expert in all of these subjects, but I'm an expert in trying to get them covered during a really challenging time. So, here we go. We can talk a little bit about that. How Michigan business is emerging from pandemic. In healthcare, this is obviously probably the biggest area of coverage for us during the pandemic. It touches everybody. It's business, it's healthcare, it's literally life and death. There'll never be enough time to cover all the healthcare stories that you could cover in a pandemic. So it is an enormous beat for anybody to take on. So the COVID impact. Healthcare suffered severe disruption as COVID cases swamped hospitals, but much other care, such as elective procedures and the payment that went with them, ground to a halt. The way forward, federal stimulus money helped health systems stay afloat financially. Mergers and other joint agreements are the wave of the future. The fellow you see here getting a shot, do you remember back when the vaccine was first announced and everybody was, just curious about who was going to be the first one? This fellow probably had that photo beamed across, I don't know how many screens, and I don't have his name right offhand, but when you were the first to roll up your sleeve and get your shot early on, this was December of 2020, you were pretty well known. Telehealth. This is an area that is receiving a lot of attention right now. Once a novel concept with mild interest among providers, it rose to the forefront of preventative medicine. Less than 1% of Medicare primary doctor visits were telehealth and 33% of visits in April of last year, driven by the pandemic. And that is not looking like it's going to change. That is something that is going to stay with us. Remote doctor visits are increasingly common in 2021. Experts believe they will become a staple moving forward. Telehealth is now the most attractive health investment segment over the next 2 years, according to an outlook from KPMG. Hospital mergers. They've been ramping up for years. Experts are predicting that the financial strains of the pandemic will push consolidation even more. Merger trends in the past were largely consolidation of smaller rural hospitals, but the trend appears to have moved to larger systems pairing up. This is evident in the recent merger talks between Grand Rapids Spectrum Health and Southfield-based Beaumont Health. They plan to create a $12 billion 22-hospital system in West and Southwest Michigan by this fall. The new system would create the state's largest provider and employer. The two health systems are promising improved care and lower costs. Whether they can deliver those is an open question. And I pause there because we will never give up asking that question. This is a major, major business move between these two hospitals, and we are continuing to try to get more detail because it's an extremely complicated topic, but we've teamed up at one point with MyBiz, which is a West Michigan-based business publication, to have them do some of the Spectrum reporting, and we're doing some of the Beaumont reporting, and that's been an example of us consolidating and teaming up with another organization on the other side of the state. There has been a delay, not surprisingly. This is not going to be a process that's going to happen overnight. We recently wrote that the merger of Beaumont and Spectrum will not close this fall as originally planned. The health system said the organizations are cooperating with federal and state regulators that are reviewing the merger, but that review is taking longer than it anticipated. And the FTC is experiencing a surge in filings across all industries and will take longer to review the particular Beaumont Spectrum filing. Mark Geary, Beaumont's head of communications, told us recently that they're eager to launch this, but they recognize that it's probably going to be delayed, which will give us more time to ask more questions. In the nonprofit world, that's another beat that we cover at Crain's with regularity. COVID impact. Community needs were spiking, but finances became a struggle for charitable nonprofits as fundraisers ground to a halt and public venues were closed or limited. The way forward for nonprofits, a predicted surge in closures of nonprofits hasn't happened yet, but might yet. Health and social service charities, some of them are emerging stronger. Not surprisingly, active participation groups have been hit the hardest. The issues that nonprofits still face, led by access to health care and economic opportunity, were there before the pandemic and have worsened for some over the past year and a half, according to the CEO of the Council of Michigan Foundations. Nonprofits that relied on active participation, arts and culture organizations that sell tickets, human service agencies that rely on fee-for-service, and charities that rely on in-person fundraising events were hurt the most. For some nonprofits, a comeback will depend on how quickly they are able to resume operating as they did before the pandemic. The new virtual operations many nonprofits adopted during the pandemic could also be more efficient and even attract new funding in the future. Increased money flowed to critical human service agencies providing food and shelter. Nonprofits involved in vaccine education, outreach and drives, and intermediary organizations providing pass-through grants, such as community foundations and United Way agencies, also saw donations and grants rise. So it wasn't a totally across-the-board negative, and many of these nonprofits, like a lot of businesses, pivoted to online fundraisers and new ways of keeping their donations flowing. State government. Not surprisingly, this is kind of at the nexus of just about everything that's gone on during the pandemic. We could probably devote an entire session to talking about the political ramifications of how the pandemic was handled at the state level. But Crain's has very active coverage of state government. Chad Livengood, our senior editor, is our columnist and person in Lansing, and he has been keeping on top of what's going on in state government. Overall, the COVID impact on state government swiftly shifted to delivering services remotely. The way forward, the great remote work experiment, is likely to lead to a push to further decrease and consolidate the amount of office space taken up by state workers. Cadillac Place, the state of Michigan's office building on West Grand Boulevard in Detroit, was already underused before the pandemic hit. More than a third of the building's 1.4 million square feet of office space is vacant. State government leaders hope to return to the office by July 12. Remember that. But that plan is once again on indefinite hiatus. Most of the downsizing in a variety of state office buildings across the state was already in the works before the pandemic sent a majority of the state's 47,000 workers home to work remotely. The need for government office space is shrinking. For the past decade, state agencies have been slowly reducing the footprint of rented space in Lansing and satellite locations to consolidate operations. State officials expect there will be a contraction of office space in the coming years as departments reassess how they deliver services. Depending on the permanency of work-from-home options, the agencies will have to adjust their needs for office space in Detroit and elsewhere in the suburbs, according to the director of the Michigan Department of Technology Management and Budget. State government, unlike private businesses, there's more hesitation, I would say, about coming back to the office because there needs to be protocols in place, and they just have more, I suspect, hurdles to jump over to get people to come back than a private business would. Manufacturing. This is also a huge beat for us. This covers a tremendous number of different kinds of manufacturing, including the auto industry. Our sister publication, Automotive News, exclusively focuses on the auto industry and covers the big three and all that kind of thing. Crain's Detroit covers suppliers and non-automotive related manufacturing. So during the pandemic, we were inside factories. We covered the supplier, how the changes and the problems in the auto manufacturers kind of came down to affect the suppliers as well. It was very difficult, I would say, regarding this photo, it was very difficult to get inside of places during the pandemic when we were covering stories. My first question as a newspaper editor is always, let's get art, let's get a photo, let's get inside there. During the pandemic, you couldn't do that. There were protocols, there were masking issues, there were vaccine issues. And it was really frustrating because what makes a good news story is being there and being able to tell readers, what is this company doing to keep its employees safe? What do the partitions look like that they're enacting? What does their lunchroom look like now that they've brought workers back and they're trying to get, they're trying to get people back on the line? What does that look like? We always ask, we don't always get in, but in some cases, like in this one, we did. This is a warehouse in Chesterfield Township in August 2021. But we do not have a lot of photos from the early days of the pandemic, in manufacturing facilities and in other places, because the shutdown for people meant the shutdown for us as well. Manufacturing led the way on returning to in-person work safely. A predicted drop in demand happened, but it was short-lived. The way forward, a shortage of microchips has played havoc with the automotive market and isn't close to being solved. This is putting new emphasis on flexibility. You've heard a lot about the microchip shortage. I'm not an expert on it, but I can tell you that it's one of the biggest ongoing issues that we're covering. The auto industry feared total collapse when the coronavirus pandemic put a halt to production, and tanking vehicle sales brought on flashbacks to the Great Recession. Over the course of just a year, though, the problem has reversed. Automakers cannot make new cars fast enough. The reason the industry is now grappling with a multi-billion-dollar dilemma the size of a fingernail. Also known as the integrated circuit or computer chip, they're made of tiny blocks of silicon, cobalt, and copper, and sit inside almost every electronic device. Consulting firm AlixPartners said last month that the ongoing semiconductor chip shortage will cost the global automotive industry $210 billion this year, a greater revenue loss than previously predicted. Every time we write a story about this, the number gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Production of 7.7 million vehicles could be lost. That's nearly double the 3.9 million vehicles the firm estimated would be lost when it issued its May forecast. Unfortunate events such as the COVID lockdowns in Malaysia and continued problems elsewhere have exacerbated things, according to Mark Wakefield, who works at AlixPartners. The effect on the auto industry is pretty obvious. It continues to hammer automakers. Toyota, Honda, Hyundai, Kia, and Mazda reported lower U.S. sales just this month, and GM, Stellantis, and Nissan were down 10% or more in the third quarter. GM, delivering its first sales update since July, was among the hardest hit. Its third quarter light vehicle deliveries slumped 33% to 443,117, the company's lowest three-month tally since its 2009 bankruptcy. I added a note to add Ford, but I have not got Ford, so sorry about that. Some buyers are balking at higher transaction prices and limited choices and deciding to wait on the sidelines until inventory improves. Pandemic recovery is still a challenge. Tight microchip stockpiles combined with other supply chain disruptions are undermining the industry's recovery from the pandemic. Severe weather and flooding that struck the Gulf Coast and eastern seaboard also put a dent in volume last month. Some dealers have run out of new vehicles to sell multiple times over the last several months. We are working on a story right now about the fact that there are so many backed up vehicles that automakers are running out of places to put them. And if you've passed by some lots or empty places along the highway, you will notice just fields and fields and fields of vehicles sitting waiting to be sold. The average number of days a new vehicle sat on a dealer lot before being sold was on pace to fall to a record low of 23 days in September, down from 54 days a year ago and down 2 days from August 2021. It's not just the microchips. Other material shortages abound right now, from steel and seat foam to labor, of course, continue to be a drag on the industry. While the fractured supply chain poses daunting challenges to profitability, the consensus is that it beats the alternative of a sustained economic recession, which most experts now are not expecting. There are odd shortages. We have written stories about if you go to the supermarket or go to the mall, you'll notice over the course of Corona that things are just sometimes missing. And we've done a number of stories about the supply chain being out of whack. Our economics reporter has referred to it as the bullwhip effect, when one shortage affects everything else down the line, and it's happened in many different areas. EVs are becoming a critical segment, and here's where Ford's news last week was a big deal. Automakers and suppliers are racing to sharpen their focus on electric and autonomous vehicles during the pandemic and previous to that, of course. In the past year, the amount of investment committed to electric vehicles by automakers and suppliers has jumped 41% to $330 billion through 2025, according to the Alex Partners analysis. Ford announced in May that it plans to boost EV investment to $30 billion through 2025, and that it anticipates 40% of global sales to be EVs by 2030. GM has said it will invest $35 billion into that space in the next 5 years. Many large suppliers are following their lead, including BorgWarner, which laid out a plan in March to scale up EV revenue to 45% total business by 2030. Ford's big news last week. They said they would spend $7 billion and create nearly 11,000 jobs to build electric vehicles and batteries in Tennessee and Kentucky. It's the largest single manufacturing investment in its 118-year history. The investment is meant to vault Ford among the leaders in EV output, and it will include a 3,600-acre mega campus northeast of Memphis called Blue Oval City that will include Ford's first new vehicle assembly plant in more than 50 years. The site, which is 3 times the size of the automaker's Rouge complex in Michigan, will hire about 6,000 people to assemble next-generation electric F-Series pickups and include battery cell production and a supplier park, according to Ford. It's expected to open in 2025. The battery park is part of Ford's vision. That is going to be south of Louisville. They're going to build a 1,500-acre battery park with a partnership with SK Innovation. The site will comprise 2 battery plants making advanced lithium-ion batteries. Ford said the Kentucky site will create 5,000 jobs. SK Innovation is committing $4.4 billion on the projects, bringing the total investment to $11.4 billion. This happened after Ford formed the partnership with SK Innovation in May after Jim Farley, the CEO, reversed plans from his predecessor to buy batteries from outside suppliers. They're choosing instead to keep it in-house. That's a big part of Ford's plan, is to make sure that they are the ones producing the batteries. Ford's announcement, and we covered this a lot last week, you probably heard a lot about this, has prompted debate in Michigan on how we can offer more shovel-ready sites to land massive projects like this in the future. The governor made a remark last week that Ford really didn't give the state a chance to bid on the project. Ford said basically, no, that's really not true. You didn't have the land ready, the electricity ready. We would have looked in Michigan probably if there had been land available. And that announcement from Ford has prompted a lot of soul searching among economic development types in Michigan and leaders who are getting together to figure out how to make sure that the next time a project like this comes along, there's land that's ready to go, that has the electricity. DTE and consumers are working with the Michigan Economic Development Corporation as we speak to try to make sure that there are attractive packages on electric rates for companies that come in and want a site like this. It's the size and the scope of what Ford is doing is beyond anything right now that Michigan is able to offer. And there's a lot of discussion about going forward how to make sure that doesn't happen. Small business and retail. We added a small business reporter at Crain this year for the first time in a while. It's a really good time to do that because the pandemic was incredibly difficult for small business people all over the country, but in Michigan in particular. Small businesses took a huge hit, especially those that were slow to adapt to web-based services and delivery. The way forward. The pandemic increased customers' appetites for convenience. Many of the physical changes in retail space, as simple as plexiglass dividers, are likely to stick around for a while. This fellow was in Eastern Market at his bar. They pivoted to carry out and sold cocktails in pouches so that you could walk away with your cocktail in a pouch. We didn't have to go far for that photo. It was right next door to Crain. So you do what you have to do, right? The importance of the web for small businesses. Businesses with a substantial online presence prior to the pandemic were at an advantage, along with those that could more easily shift to remote work, according to Kelley, who's the head of the Small Business Association of Michigan. Businesses associated with entertainment, gatherings, conventions, sit-downs, office real estate, downtown districts, those are just now starting to recover. They were hit very hard at the beginning of the pandemic. New retail trends. Remote shopping was huge for consumers and retailers. Businesses that added online shopping options and curbside pickup have been the most successful during the pandemic. Plexiglass partitions separating customers and employees, hand cleaning stations, free masks, all that sort of thing will stick around too. Shoppers' preference for convenience has only intensified during the pandemic, according to Michigan Retailers Association President and CEO Bill Hallen. He said customers have embraced home delivery. We do not see demand for that service slowing down. The big question mark at the moment is how to continue to operate with a labor shortage. That's particularly concerning for smaller retailers who cannot afford to pay higher hourly wages. We've read a lot about the labor shortage. We'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute. Sometimes folks say, well, just pay higher wages. That isn't the answer for everybody. Not everybody. Like smaller retailers simply can't do that. So that's why you've seen many of them shut down or go out of business. Another big area of coverage for Crain, we have added a residential real estate reporter this year because of our reader interest in this segment of the business industry. We have a commercial real estate reporter, Kirk Pinho, who's incredibly well dialed in and has really been the first one to report major developments and new businesses and throughout Southeast Michigan and outstate. He knows who owns the buildings and what's moving in and who's moving out. And again, sourcing is very important for a beat like that. When it comes to real estate, the COVID impact, the pandemic left many offices empty or nearly so and put a scare into commercial landlords about the future and value of their properties. The way forward, much uncertainty remains as the future of a flexible workforce has to play out. The Delta variant threw a curve to many businesses hoping to welcome employees back this fall. And that's the Ren Sen, by the way. It's empty. Disruption and uncertainty. Every property class, except for warehouse and distribution space, experienced severe disruption during COVID. Office tenants were forced to work from home, leaving landlords with empty buildings in Detroit and suburbs. Sublease space surged. Retailers and restaurants in large numbers were forced to close, creating revenue crunches for those businesses and subsequently their building owners as tenants struggled with rent. Some strip center investors, for example, filed for bankruptcy. Projects were halted and repurposed. Lawsuits over unpaid rent were filed. Apartment building owners, with many of their own renters having lost their jobs, were worried about their monthly collections. Evictions for unpaid rent and foreclosures for unpaid mortgages were banned, though had resumed in, in limited fashion by September. With business and other travel constricted, hotel owners had far less room rental revenue, forcing many into special servicing on their loans. Some hotel owners repurposed their property entirely for new uses. Construction halted for weeks, and projects that prominently featured office, retail, and hotel were thrown for a loop. Bright spots. The one area of real estate that is doing super well, warehouse or distribution centers. Also, self-storage. We're working on a story right now about how every corner in Metro Detroit seems to have a self-storage unit on it. I don't know why. I don't know if people have that much stuff. That's one of the things we're asking as we write this story. But if you own a big empty building that can hold a lot of stuff, you're doing pretty well during COVID. The pandemic put demand for that kind of property into overdrive as online shopping became even more prevalent. The Census Bureau said that in the second quarter last year, online shopping surged 31.8% to $203.8 billion. That is a red-hot market for those uses. Retailers like Lowe's and Home Depot flourished as homeowners sought to remodel and embark on home projects, offices, and otherwise. I bought a new house during the pandemic because I couldn't stand my home, the lack of a home office. That's a whole nother story because, of course, looking for residential real estate this year was insane. My hobby became getting rejected by, for bids on houses, but I finally found one, and it was driven by the fact that I liked the home office, which is kind of sad because it means we're probably not going back full-time ever again, but that's a whole other issue. One surprise along the way, news of the death of the traditional office was greatly exaggerated. It's not all shutting down, but it's forcing companies to rethink what it will take to draw employees back. Companies will be more thoughtful in how space is used and will create environments that give workers a reason to come back to the office. Crain, for example, during the pandemic, tore out a back room of our newsroom and transformed it into a gorgeous space, a gathering space with new tables and a ping pong table and a giant screen TV and a wine cooler and a Keurig and all, because they want, the owners of our company want people to be comfortable and they want people to come back. And this is an example of how companies all over are rethinking how they use their space. Banking, another area of coverage for us that involves a lot of change during the pandemic. Banks had to adjust to fully remote workforces themselves in many cases, just as demand for their services spiked because of the Paycheck Protection Program. Remember that? Remember when every third story you read was about the PPP, who was getting the money, what they were using it for, who deserved it, who didn't deserve it. That was a big deal for a while. It's kind of calmed down now. The way forward, the big question for banks going forward, customers still want the convenience of a branch even if they're not going to use it that often. So they want to know it's there even if they don't use it. This is a photo of, in August 21, Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan Chase came to town to Detroit to announce the opening of a community center branch in Corktown. While he was there, he told our reporters that a second shutdown would be basically a death knell for the economy. So that's what led our story and not the community center branch. But we still covered the community center branch. Challenging times for banks, especially smaller community lenders, found themselves forced to push up timelines on technology efforts that they figured would be years in the making. At the same time, bankers adjusted to largely remote workforces and concerned customers. They were also tasked with implementing the Paycheck Protection Program. Bankers, by and large, say they made the pivot to some remote work where possible, and they managed to get this new massive federal program up and running to the best of their ability, with a focus on the needs of business clients who had serious concerns as mandated shutdowns were rampant. Balancing customers' needs. The potential for a liquidity crisis sparked by nervous customers withdrawing funds early in the pandemic made for the number one fear of bankers, according to one banker that we interviewed out of Oxford, community lender Oxford Bank. That ultimately did not play out. Looking forward, banks increasingly must balance the need for some sort of physical presence while acknowledging that a slew of physical branches may not be sustainable. And that's the guy who said, I believe that people don't really want to go to the branch, but they just want to know there's a branch around. As someone who bought a house during the pandemic, I can tell you that you still do need branches on occasion. So I'm glad that, they're there when you do need them. Okay, here's a fun one, cannabis. This is an absolutely exploding area of coverage for us. We have a reporter now dedicated to this. Crain 2 weeks ago during Mackinac made the announcement that we have purchased a cannabis publication. I think it's called Green Market Report. And there is an almost insatiable appetite, not only for the cannabis itself, but for the coverage of cannabis. It has become a business exploding industry in Michigan, and during the pandemic, it affected it in several ways. The freshly legal recreational cannabis business was hit very quickly by COVID and slowed expansions. But the way forward for cannabis, the designation by the government as essential gave the business a shot of legitimacy. The industry is emerging from the pandemic with growth in certain types of businesses like social lounges still to come. This is from Utopia Gardens in downtown Detroit. Chem X4 Purple. I don't know what I like the names that they sometimes give them, but that's pretty scientific right there. Weed keeps moving. Recreational cannabis became legal to sell in Michigan on December 1, 2019. Just a few months later, the state shut down. The state deemed both adult use and medical cannabis shops essential businesses, though for a time they were allowed only curbside sales and delivery and had to shut down their interiors just as restaurants did. The weed kept moving and the industry continued to grow. The fact that they allowed curbside and deemed us essential was a saving grace for the cannabis industry at a time when it was just getting off the ground, according to John McLeod, who's co-founder of the Troy-based Cloud Cannabis Company. Sales are rising. Looking at the raw numbers, recreational cannabis sales are going up and up. Michigan sellers took in $14.8 million in recreational sales in February 2020 and nearly $22 million by March of that year. It went up to $60 million in September, dipped slightly in the fall, and now it's rising again. In 2021, the industry is seeing yet more success, $98 million in sales in March and $105 million in April. The state of Michigan is rapidly approaching $1 billion in sales since the recreational sector first opened. Construction and hiring in the cannabis industry were affected. That's not to say the pandemic didn't slow development. Supply chain slowdowns during the pandemic affected construction of new facilities for recreational cannabis. It does seem like they're on every corner, and even out here in West Michigan, it kind of blows my mind to see how many places where you would not expect there to be a lot of cannabis action and activity, they're all over. This is a statewide phenomenon. In the thick of it, cannabis businesses also had to deal with delays in shipments of packaging, PPE, and cleaning supplies and other items. Also, the labor shortage is hitting the cannabis industry. Cloud, for example, now has 4 stores, but it's been struggling to hire, which is happening for everybody. The pandemic may have helped spur increasing acceptance of legal cannabis. State governments across the country designating cannabis as essential during the lockdown became one of the most momentous moments in the timeline of the nation's legal marijuana industry, according to the national publication Marijuana Business Daily. That's because it puts the cannabis industry in the same category as pharmacies, hospitals, and other sources of legitimate medicine. So, in general, those are a couple of, that's a rundown of some of the specific beats and areas that Crain covers and what we've seen kind of before and after as we emerge. A few things I just wanted to talk about briefly that don't really fall into one particular category, but it's something that we are covering and will continue to cover as the pandemic continues. The hiring sign is a hint. The labor shortage. 74% of businesses surveyed in September by the National Federation of Independent Businesses cited a mild to significant staffing shortage. 82% of those surveyed said they are losing sales opportunities due to their inability to fill vacant positions. One of the fun things we do every morning at Crain on our morning meetings where we talk about stories is we complain about whatever fast food restaurant we've gone to the day before that had a sign on the window that said, "Sorry, closed, not hiring." There was a sign at a Taco Bell in Metro Detroit the other day that said, "Don't like it? Fill out an application." So some of these places are getting a little salty about, the people coming through the drive-through. This is happening all over, and if there was an anecdotal way to gauge the labor shortage, the Crain reporters who have snapped photographs of these signs on fast food windows could probably do an entire story on that. This is the interesting part of the labor shortage. Low-income workers in particular are on the move, leading the charge in what we kind of informally call the Great Resignation. People are quitting their jobs, period. According to the August job seeker report by Bankrate, 72% of respondents earning less than $30,000 per year are looking for a new job, compared to just 40% of those making $80,000 or more. 55% said they plan to have a new job in the next year. Theories about this abound. We have done reams and reams of copy and stories about, was it overly generous unemployment benefits? For a long time, that was blamed for keeping people at home. Well, those benefits expired. We don't have the extra above and beyond anymore, and the labor shortage has not abated. It did not rise the way some people said it would. Other issues that are at play here, lack of child care. If you have children or grandchildren in school right now, you know how unpredictable it is. Quarantine is still a thing. Many of these kids are getting sent home when they're exposed to COVID. That means that they're out for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and someone has to be home to watch them. So the effect of COVID on employment of women in particular has been devastating. The numbers of women dropping out of the workforce nationally are immense, and they have not come back fully. And that may be one of the reasons, and that's why a lot of companies, I think, right now are trying to find a way to accommodate that child care issue when they want people to come back to the office. And there's COVID concerns. Some people are not comfortable coming back to work. They don't want to risk it. They don't want to, for a minimum wage job, they don't want to go in and potentially be exposed to COVID. So, there are multiple reasons why this labor shortage is continuing. But the bottom line is there's still far more jobs available than people. Another very important topic over the last year and a half that we've all been grappling with, diversity and inclusion. As awareness of racial and social injustices and inequities has become more urgent, businesses and organizations are looking in the mirror at their diversity practices. At the same time, customers are demanding more. A company can't just post a message of solidarity on social media. Customers are looking for concrete actions from the companies and brands that they buy from. Companies are seeking to improve hiring practices to be more inclusive or train employees on diversity, equity, inclusion topics like unconscious bias. Some are creating diversity councils and are using DEI scorecards to hold themselves accountable for making progress internally and externally. And this is obviously a topic that cannot be covered in one slide. This was a major issue during the pandemic, and in our reporting, we have tried to be as inclusive as possible, and companies are now aware of this issue in a way that they have not been before. So we should expect more on this, I think, in the coming year. Lastly, a new landscape of work. The pandemic has shaken up office-based work, most particularly. It's shaken up everybody's workforce, but office-based, perhaps for good. Companies that expected a return to normal in fall 2021 are now in indefinite hybrid mode while the Delta variant plays out. Childcare continues to be a major challenge for many workers as quarantine requirements interrupt schools and daycares. Downtowns and central business districts are grappling with the glut of office space. This is one of the issues that my previous employer, the Detroit News, is dealing with. The News and the Free Press are now sharing space in a building downtown owned by Dan Gilbert. And they used to own their own buildings. They sold them because of money problems within the newspaper industry. Not a surprise, not a secret. They're now leasing space in a downtown building, and they're not using that space. And, I don't know how long the parent company, Gannett, is going to want them to pay for space that nobody's using. Luckily, Crain owns our own building downtown, which is a little bit of a relief, but a lot of companies are in this position. How long do you pay for utilities and lights and heat and maintenance on buildings that are sitting empty? That is something that we don't know what's going to happen with that. Congress is considering a bill to give tax credits to developers who convert unused office space to residential, but it's still in the early stages. We just did a story about this last week. Senators Stabenow and Peters have introduced legislation that would let developers get a little bit of a tax credit for turning some of that unused office space into apartments. Metro Detroit, the city of Detroit in particular, does not have nearly the level of apartment space that, say, Cincinnati does, which has far smaller population. So, is it an answer to convert empty space for people to come live? We don't know. That's one of the questions that we'll be asking. The developers that we talked to said it's too early to tell, and that their biggest problem is not for tax credits, it's because there's too much regulation and burdensome red tape in trying to convert office to residential. So we'll see.
Why was the state of Michigan caught so unaware about Ford's huge move?
Metro Detroit, in particular, has a very fragmented territorial approach to economic development. There's a lot of layers of government to get through if you want to put together an effective site, a large site for a project like that. And the corporate leaders in Detroit, I think, have recognized this over the last couple of years, and they formed the Detroit Regional Partnership, which is a new organization whose goal was to force governments to work together to market sites like this. But that organization is still in the early stages, and they really have not had the money to go after assembling parcels of land, buying it, preparing it, all that sort of thing. We reported last week that there's a $100 million fund that's been proposed for that particular purpose. But when you look at what Tennessee spent, for example, just preparing that site, I think it was like $500 million or something to that effect. So even if they do, approve that money, it's going to be a drop in the bucket. There needs to be a more coordinated effort. And I do think that it was a wake-up call. Ford's announcement was a wake-up call. I can't believe they didn't know that it was happening, but I think they knew that they simply, as Ford told us, the state of Michigan was not a serious contender because they just didn't have the incredible preparation and infrastructure needed for a battery plant, for example. A battery plant takes an enormous amount of electricity. You can't just take a piece of land and say, oh, it's ready. That has to be a coordinated effort with the utility companies and the local governments to make a piece of property available.
For several years now, on and off, I hear a story about, okay, one day all the baby boomers are going to retire all at the same time, and then we're not going to have enough workers to do everything anymore. How much, for the current labor shortage, how much impact is because of retirements maybe that were done a little earlier than originally expected? How much is it specifically about retirements, do you think?
I think that's part of it. I think demographics is part of it, but as the mother of a 22-year-old who just graduated from U of M, by the way, I'm a state person, so that was really hard. But I've learned to live with it after I've given so much money to U of M. I think that, and again, I am absolutely not an expert, but what we have reported is showing that young people, my daughter's age and her friends, they don't look at work the same way that we did. I mean, I think that younger people have different expectations about the workforce. They're less tied to particular companies. They move around more. This idea that you're going to graduate from college and then come out and have a job and stay there for 10 years, I think is just not happening anymore. The friends my daughter's age are job hopping, and they don't see it as a sign of, being flighty. They see it as, if this isn't working for me, I'm leaving and I'm going to find some place that does. So that's not necessarily a scientific answer, but I mean, anecdotally, I think that there is a real disruption going on right now in how we work and what people expect out of work and what younger people expect out of work. And a lot of things that we took for granted, even, in my generation, in terms of 401ks and pensions and things like that, those are not a given anymore. And so young people, I think, are just less, they're a little bit more cynical about what companies can offer them. It's a really interesting dilemma, and I think demographics definitely plays a part of it, but I think the pandemic has made a lot of people rethink what they want out of work. That idea that I referenced in the Great Resignation, people are quitting their jobs. And, you know, one of my colleagues that I love dearly, who's worked in the journalism business forever, called up one day a couple weeks ago and said, you know what, I went out to New Hampshire over the weekend, and my husband and I saw a farm, and we bought it. And, you know, people are in a different place emerging from the pandemic. They're rethinking their values. They're rethinking, do I want to work 5 days a week? Maybe I want, you know, people they're not tied to the office in the way that we used to be. And that's causing a ripple effect, I think, up and down the line.
What are the chances that in some of these situations we're going to overreact? Look at housing, for example. Looking at the number of structures that are being built and the demographics where there are going to be fewer families in the future. Are we going to be another evergreen?
That's something that we are going to continue to cover. One of the problems that we've been reporting on recently is that there are very, very few opportunities for young people to get into first-time housing. The housing craze is really shutting out first-time and low-income home buyers. The balance of housing is really out of whack right now. You know, the condo market in Detroit is doing really well. It's booming. Higher-end places are booming. But younger people are not able to find houses to buy. And they're trying to rent, and that's creating shortages of rental properties. Everything is out of whack. I'm not an economist, so I don't know specifically, you know, whether we're building too many, but based on what we've been covering, we're not building it we're not proportioning things right. You know, we're obsessed with this housing, and houses are going for such record numbers, but there's nothing for younger people to break in. There's no way for them to break in. We've been reporting on that for a while now.
Is there a concern from an employer perspective that as we come out of this pandemic and people start coming back to work, that the employers may come to a realization that maybe we don't need all these people. We don't need all this space. We already know that. And is there going to be, I kind of perceive there's probably going to be some reaction from employers once things start to turn around, that they're going to start to reduce employment because they think they can get by with fewer.
I hope you're wrong in regard to my own personal situation. Because I think that news organizations in particular have been shrinking like crazy, and the pandemic has not been good for us. My fear, just when I mentioned the news and the free press, I mean, my fear is out of sight, out of mind. That, you know, if you've been able to kind of get along with reduced hours, reduced staff, you know, that people will want to make it permanent. I think that's absolutely a possibility. It's happening at the same time that there's a labor shortage. So maybe these companies that have been able to sort of limp along with fewer people will end up not filling those positions at all, just cut them out of the budget. I think that's entirely possible. One of the things that we didn't really touch on is the impact of the vaccine mandates and whether companies, you know, what companies are going to do, how far they're going to go to invest in the safety of employees to bring them back. We have had a lot of coverage over the last couple of months about whether private companies should mandate, whether health systems should mandate. As you know, the hospitals now in Metro Detroit are all mandating. I think that Henry Ford said just a couple days ago that they had 99% compliance, but that was after they let go of the ones who did not get vaccinated. That's why you have to be a little careful with statistics. They let go of, I think, 400 people left out of, their workforce from not getting vaccinated. But that's all part of the return to the office. What is it going to look like? My own employer is, I know, grappling with, do we have an app on people's phones where you show that you've been vaccinated? Do you require masks? Do you require them in the common areas, or just when you're walking around the hallways? It is a really difficult time to be an employer right now. This is all so uncharted territory. But if I know, just based on my own experience working for media for 30 years, if you can go a couple years without a position being filled and you're still selling the paper, then yeah, you could probably cut that.
Is there any talk or any work in the private business world about getting manufacturing back here in the States? And especially I'm thinking of computer chips and pharmaceuticals.
I think that there is a desire for that, sure. I'm not aware of anything specific right now beyond what we've talked about in terms of making sure that Michigan is ready for high-tech manufacturing. The whole future is high-tech. It's mobility. There's a lot of talk about mobility. We've reported about the Center for Mobility out in Southeast Michigan. I think at the I'm losing my train of thought on that, but there is mobility has not necessarily come around as quickly in Michigan as we had hoped it would. It was kind of supposed to be the wave of the future 4, 5, 10 years ago, and it's kind of been eclipsed by the EV developments, and those are going to other states, and I think that the important thing is that when they come along, that the state is ready. And I know that there's a lot of talk and there's a lot of debate over what we need to do. Is it tax incentives? Every time a project comes up like this, there's debate over whether it makes sense to give these big companies tax breaks. Some states have spent a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of tax breaks luring companies in, and they don't really see a return on that investment. So there's kind of talk about whether there's a different thing that you can offer companies to locate here. Is it reduced electric rates? Is it, there's a lot of debate over that.
Kelley, as you drove in today, you could probably tell we're a beautiful resort community in a rural area. And one of the things we've discovered is the lack of availability of high-speed internet, broadband, is creating some serious equity issues in terms of education, healthcare, economic. Is that what you're seeing across the state, or is that more confined to rural areas?
I think that we have seen that in rural areas. The UP, we've done some stories about connectivity in the UP. When everything went online at the beginning of the pandemic, especially learning and school, connectivity was a huge, huge factor. Even in the city of Detroit, which is as urban as it gets, the connectivity issues were a problem for a lot of students who took laptops home or who took tablets home. Just giving people tablets doesn't mean they're connecting and learning. We did a lot of stories about kids who disappeared off the grid during COVID because either they couldn't get internet access, or they didn't know how, or their parents weren't, helping get them online. It's not just a rural problem. It is definitely a rural problem for sure, but it is something that we saw within the city of Detroit during the pandemic. And I know that there's a lot of initiatives. There are city council initiatives working to get in Detroit kids connected, better broadband, faster internet. It's a problem all over. And I think you will see more of that because, we're still not fully back. Everybody's still doing remote to some extent.
not really a question, but a little clarification on the chip shortage. The automakers share more than half the blame for where they're at. They're using two generation old technology, and they've just continued to build on it. And they were told over a decade ago that they've got to shift to the new architectures or they're going to be in trouble. Why? Because the growing markets for chips are military, medical, aerospace, and they are immensely dense chips with very high power. And consequently, when the automotive companies went down with the COVID, these plants were all shifted over to a whole different architecture that the car companies can't use. And there's been talk of building new chip plants, but they'd be building chip plants to build outdated architecture. And it's looking like they're going to be able to use the newer architectures on electric cars. So there's a catch-22 there, and you don't change the chip plant over in a week. That takes months, and there's no guarantee, at least with the automotive industry, that you're going to get your money back for all that time.
You know, you've just given me a very good story idea. That's a very good point. As the shortage drags on, I guarantee that more and more of us are going to become more and more educated about exactly what these chips do and why they're not coming in where they should be, and it's more than just cars. They're in so many things. So thank you. That's a good story idea. Thank you. Thank you.